Hi, everybody, from wherever you are listening in. Welcome. I'm Tim Austin, coach at EncompassLifeCoaching.com and host of this Navigate podcast. We're going to continue our conversation today with missiologist Jeff Simons. Jeff and his wife, Sara, have become colleagues and collaborators since our paths crossed almost 2 years ago while they were still serving in the country of Spain. In this episode, we get to continue our conversation around landing and setting up well. Each of these episodes with Jeff can stand alone, but if you haven't yet listened to our first talk we did together, I encourage you to have a listen. It's episode number 24. Jeff Simons is a missiologist at core with an MA in intercultural studies. He works out his passion and calling as a trained leadership coach and cross-cultural companion to global workers in major transition. Jeff does this in partnership with his wife, Sara, the founder of The Way Between, an organization serving global leaders in major transition. They are family on mission with their 2 kids now residing in Denver, Colorado after 12 years of overseas work in 3 countries. There's so much that goes into processing and planning major transitions. There are so many areas that need our attention. It can definitely feel overwhelming. But what would it look like to have a map and a compass for the journey? Jeff Simons continues to help us unpack some of that today as we talk about a structure called missions mapping. So let's dive into my conversation with Jeff Simons. Hey, Jeff, thanks again for being with me in that last episode that we had together, and for returning. You came back for more, and I'm really glad you did, because I think we have more to talk about today.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, always good to talk to you, and really appreciate all that you're doing and putting out there. So,
thank you. Well, we appreciate you and how you guys serve the global community of workers and organizations and people that I know that you come alongside and really are making a difference. And tell what's just a little update from you guys as far as your transition.
Yes. So it feels like big rock every week. We have running The Way Between from the Denver area now. And we are still on our soft landing. We're still figuring out where that final housing will be, whether that be rent or buying is one of the big pieces that we've been kind of getting a lot of research from real estate agents and the housing market and all of that, and kind of adding that to our physical map of our mission mapping strategy. We just spent some time up in another little area, Arvada, last night, just driving around and then walking the downtown strip and looking at some houses that were for sale and just praying that the Lord would show us some things. And have been talking to a couple of other local pastors and what their sense of what's going on spiritually, what are the needs of the local community, how to plug ourselves in as a family in a community and a social local ministry, as well as having our global ministry of The Way Between. So we're still on the transition. I feel like I've checked off 22 of 39 major steps. I kind of just made a quick list, just sort of as a fun thing. What are the big pieces that we have to do to get from setting down life well in Spain to setting up life well here? And we're still in that process. So been here 3 months, but it feels like the transition is still going. So
It'll be interesting just to as we kind of follow how God is leading you and where you guys land and how that all plays out as you're being intentional around this whole process, and which leads us to the missions mapping strategy that you guys are implementing in this transition, and how you're being intentional around landing and setting up well. From our last conversation together, we pulled out a couple of those lenses and you unpacked them for us. And so we're going to dive into unpacking a couple more of those lenses. And so before we do that, why don't you just give us a quick review and a context for what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, great, great. Yeah. So this, really, I've come to realize that landing and setting up well is really kind of the more operative, approachable, realness of what this is. The mission
Mm.
mapping strategy is what we incorporate into this.
It sounds
Um,
cool though.
so yeah, I even said, hey, can we change the title? Because I actually realized the subtitle should be the main title. Yeah, this, just a little bit of background. This really comes out of some deep missiology and anthropology, social study. Key references would be R. Daniel Shaw in his book Transculturation. There's also elements of McGavran's Bridges of God, some of the people movement, missiology, and all that comes into this as well. But really what we've been developing out of some of those main resources and then our own experience on the field and then working with hundreds of cross-cultural workers with missionaries is there's really 7 main lenses that we can be very intentional to put on as we're entering a new place and figuring out how to set up life well. And not just coming with our usual assumptions, maybe as Americans or wherever we're coming from. Sometimes we can think about the ways that we would often go up setting up life in a new city for a new job or something. And there's actually some real differences in when we're taking a missional posture on a place. And that's where these 7 lenses come from. So I'll just read the titles of these lenses too. We covered a couple last time. But here's the 7 lenses. We're not going to fill out all of them today, like you said, but just to give you some interest there. The first one would be spiritual landscape, reading the land spiritually. Overlapping with that, number 2 would be history of place. Third is bicultural bridges, which we're going to talk about today. The 4th is the diversity and dispersion of the people throughout the area that you're planting in and setting up life in. The 5th is family values and sustainability. We talked about that last week. The 6th would be global mission, and that's a new word that's been phrased that combines global mission and local mission. And how do we put on both of those lenses when we're setting up in a new place? And then last is living space and transport. Very tangible one. We're going to be talking about that one today. And so that's a little review on those and where we're headed.
Great. Yeah. And what I love about this is I've been reflecting on it, Jeff, is this process, if you will, for landing and setting up well is, oftentimes when we look for direction, when we're moving somewhere, when we're shifting to something else, we automatically kind of, or at least a lot of times, I personally kind of go by what I see around me visually. But I think a process like this for me can help me to go a little deeper than just by what I see, but kind of help me feel and to discern what's happening. What's there spiritually? What's there in my heart? How am I getting in touch with God's heart around all of this? So I just as we go into this, that's just kind of my 2 cents in terms of the advantage of embracing a process like this for such big, momentous decisions in our lives. So let's just go ahead and dive right into what you got for us. I think we're going to start with bicultural bridges.
Yeah, well, just to affirm that, I think that it's exactly what kind of the intentionality of the process is. One is, a unique posture that we take with the way between and all of the coaching and training that we do with people who are operating cross-culturally is how do we continue to stay present to our whole being, and not just, especially when we're in transition and there's a million decisions to make, we often just go to the cognitive, we kind of live in the head. And these lenses help us actually connect with our whole being, stop and take account for our heart, our emotions.
Good.
Get in touch with the Spirit, get in touch with the whole triune God who's already there, already working, and we're coming into, in a sense, his territory and saying, okay,
right.
Lord, how do you want me to be a tool in your mission? What are you already doing here? And how do I, come in and really observe and join that rather than just living in my head and operating out of the cognitive during the stress of transition, So.
Very good. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's dive into a couple of these lenses that you have to share with us today.
Great. Yeah. So today we're going to hit a couple more of the 7 lenses. We're going to hit bicultural bridges and then living space and transport. And one thing I want to just add is, as I've learned over the years, and this has been affirmed through a lot of missionary research, is that, language learning is important when you go into a place. And a lot of times our thoughts are, okay, that's a class, that's a book, that's a tutor. All of that is important. We need the basis of grammar. We need the basis of the alphabet and all of that. You can't replace that. But sometimes we put so much stock in that, thinking that will deliver us into friendship in the culture, immersion, and that kind of thing. And I want to actually challenge that and say these two particularly, these lenses we're going to look at today, bicultural bridges, living space and transport, they are the twin brother. They are the other 50% of actually digging in and immersing in a culture. And they don't have to do with books, and they don't have to do with sitting in a class. So these alongside of doing that other really can help catalyze and catapult you into immersing well in a culture. And so as a reference, I actually want to bring in a verse here, Paul from 1 Corinthians. This will be very familiar to many of you. So 1 Corinthians 9:19, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. This is a very commonly used mission verse, right? As to how do we be the Hudson Taylors? How do we become like the people that we're living among? To the Jews, I become like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I become like one under the law, though I am myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I become like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I become weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all means I might save some. I do this all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Powerful verse, wonderful challenge to really kind of get outside of ourselves, put away even our own culture, and dive in and try to become like the other. Has a great empowering message to it. We've also seen, especially in the work that we do, it has some limitations. And there's actually a helpful corrective to that of how do we not also completely lose ourselves and burn out prematurely in that process. And so as we look at these two lenses, I want you to think about this verse and what are both the empowering part of it, but also what can be the shadow side of that, where we can lose ourselves and actually get off track and burn out prematurely from the mission that the Lord has put on our hearts. So let's dive in. Shall we dive into the first one, Tim? Or
yeah, let's go ahead and dive into the first one, and so that's going to be bicultural bridges.
Yeah, bicultural bridges, and right. Just like always, Tim, you've had incredible experience on the field, and would love to hear, if this sparks any stories or memories for you. Would love to hear some of that, or any just key gems of wisdom to add to this. So bicultural bridges, it's kind of a funny term. Really, this just means key friendships in one sense, but not just any friendship, not just someone you get along with personality-wise, but actually intentionally keeping an eye for people who can be bicultural bridges in your life. These are key consultants and key relationships that you intentionally pursue and that you can regularly converse with, that know the area that you're setting up life in. They can advise you on key cultural pieces and ways to engage appropriately. Often they are natives to that area, but not always. Natives usually are the most helpful. Um, or they could be those who have lived there long enough and really done their work that they can help us more rapidly cross that cultural bridge into the new place.
Okay.
Okay. So I actually think, recently having gone through the DMM training, disciple making movements, we talk about looking for those people of peace in a city.
Right.
Sometimes they can be the same people. And I found that after I was doing some bicultural bridge work during our time 8 years in Spain, and just the Lord blessed me with a couple of really deep friendships. I'll share a couple stories, but I just began to realize too, man, these guys are people of peace in this city, and the Lord could really, and I saw the Lord really start to work through them.
Okay. So these people,
ways.
they functioned as people of peace.
They did, yeah. I don't know if that always, if they could always fill both roles, but these people really were
right.
That too. So if you have some reference to that kind of concept, sometimes, so examples, sometimes they could be real estate agents who actually know the zoning in the area as well. Sometimes they can be people working government or social clubs in the area. Sometimes they'll be expats as well, but they have spent a significant amount of time and have done their work and dug deep, and they can help you, smooth the understanding into certain ways of how the culture operates or language use.
Right. Okay.
Sometimes they can be, and this could be secondary as well, but people, not even actually people at all, but in some of your research on the area, they can be literary mentors, literary bicultural bridges, things that highlight the folklore, people who have done study and written on this area. Myths, children's stories, local colloquialisms and sayings, resources like that can end up being a bicultural bridge resource for you.
Okay.
So
now, just a quick question here. When someone is transitioning to a new place, now, are we saying that these kinds of relationships, we need to have them in place before we actually strategically make a decision to live here or land here? Or are we saying this is a process, no matter, we can take advantage of this no matter, on what side of the transition we're on?
Right.
What's your thoughts around that? Because I know, obviously, if I were to try to line up all these relationships before choosing a place to live, for example,
exactly.
Obviously that could take a while. So give us an idea kind of in terms of time frame or and your perspective on that, Jeff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously for some of the natives, the people you would get to know, it's going to take some time to identify people like this, that you're actually going to be living there. Now, I mean, I would always recommend to people, if at all possible, to find a good soft landing place, a place where they can stay temporarily for a time while they do some of this research on the local area.
Okay.
Now, I mean, even going to Spain, there were a couple people I started to identify that were expats living in Spain, had been there for a long time, and I had already heard reputation-wise that they have done their work and they've really immersed well. And so I started actually talking to some of them before we moved to Spain, and started to get some great tips and some great things, even though I didn't have the context of living in that city yet. And they continued to be great. I mean, for example, one of our closest Spanish friends took years, to build that relationship. Their father died. And, I came to learn real quickly that, the way that Spanish funerals and grieving memorial services go on are very different than what I'm used to in America. And I was trying to figure out how to be a good friend to come alongside them, when to initiate, when to give them space, when is it they're just having private family time, and when is it the community comes around them. And, it was a whole new landscape, even though we'd been there 7 years. Right. So I went to one of these expat friends, one that I had even started talking to before coming to Spain. And she was very helpful in helping to understand the grieving process. There's actually quite a a process to it, and there's only certain things that are done in a certain order. And there's times when you leave the family alone. There's times when you engage. And she was very helpful in that. So
I had Central Asia where we lived. My first language teacher was, I can't say he was the best language teacher for me. He had a lot of education, and his approach was very literary. And yet he knew so much about the country, the culture, the history. Our country had been through Civil War, and just some of the history of that, and why, some of the why we were where we were at kind of scenarios, and so he was very, very much, for me, part of that network of bicultural bridges, and being part of that.
Yeah, that's great. I remember a local language teacher in Spain too that helped actually tell a little bit of the history and why certain areas of our pueblo were named that, certain neighborhoods, and why our neighborhood was named what it was. And it just totally changed my understanding of the neighborhood, but also the names of the restaurants all harken back to the history of that area. And it brought so much more understanding.
Yes. And
where I was living in the street I lived on, and why it was named that.
Yeah. And I will say that we encountered in some of our connections and relationships there a lot of biases. There was a history of ethnic, tribal tensions, different things in the history of the country, and so regionally, there was a strong bias toward these are our people. Those people aren't so great, and this is why. Just regionally within the country, and so but it's good to get even those different perspectives. For me, I remember just being enlightened in so many ways, having those different perspectives. But you have to also take that bias into consideration, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and filter some of that through some kingdom lenses, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Right. So let me tell you a story about Tomas. Tomas is one of my dearest friends in Spain. So one of the things that, and we'll talk about this a little bit with the next lens, is my wife intentionally, as part of this lens work, there were some larger conglomerate, Walmart-y type of stores that you could go to in Spain and get everything you need and not have to really speak Spanish at all if you didn't need to. But one of the things that we intentionally did, which was quite countercultural for Americans, is to figure out how do we engage and shop locally? How do we actually, she did a lot of the grocery shopping, but she actually kind of had a route of 4 different local smaller places that she would go to, one for veggies and fruit, one for meat, one for these things. And they were smaller and local, supporting the local businesses, which is part of a value of ours, but also it forced us to engage in a lot more language. You start to see some of the locals, you see some of the same people coming through, and it really stretched us in our language use, So one of those was Tomas, who became a dear friend. He is the fruit and veggie guy. La Susana Fruteria. And every time we go in, he had a big smile on his face. He was about our age. He had kids similar age. And he just was a great guy that you could converse with. And I learned real fast, just personality wise. There was a similar personality there, but that doesn't have to be for a bicultural bridge. But there is a key thing with bicultural bridges that they're not offended by your questions. They are open if you're really have a learning posture and you're just really trying to learn the language or the culture. They will often be patient with you, which isn't always the case, when you're in a new context. But Tomas was patient with us. So I'd go in and, I'd get our fruit and veggies, but I'd stay for a half an hour and we would just chat. And I'd practice my language and I get to ask him some of those questions that have been popping up. I actually would keep them on a notes app on my phone, cultural questions that would just come up. for me along the way. Why does the traffic move this way? Why do people honk so much? Why do, this is just different
Mm-hmm.
than I'm used to in the US. And, those are things you don't learn in your language class,
Right.
why do they cut the meat this way? And is that a skirt steak or is that I don't know, because I don't know the translation, anyway, so Tomas and I would hit it off, and now and then one of the questions I just brought to him was, hey, what are some really delicious traditional Spanish dishes that I don't know about that I need to try, And so he's like, oh, puchero. You have to try puchero, and I'm like, well, what's puchero? I've never heard of it. And he's like, oh, he went on to this long story. My grandmother used to make it and my mom made it, and it's a great recipe. And it's somewhat like a Spanish version of like a chicken noodle soup, but like a little nicer. And it's really quite a simple dish, but it has a lot of, local feel and history to it. So I was like, oh, great. Well, I'd love to try it. What restaurant can I get it at? And he's like, oh, no. They don't serve it in restaurants. I was like, oh, well, how am I supposed to have it? And he said, well, my grandma would make it. And I'm like, I don't have a Spanish grandma.
Right.
So how am I supposed to try it? And he's like, oh, that's right. Oh, okay. Oh, man. I don't know where you can get it, maybe find a recipe or something, So I was like, oh, okay, well, bummer.
Yeah.
So anyway, come about 2 months later, and he didn't know this, but we happened to be sitting at home. It's New Year's Eve. All of us have a cold. We're in our PJs in the house, just kind of a miserable day, supposed to be New Year's Eve, supposed to be in a happy place. But we were having one of those rough, cultural days. Really didn't have to do with the culture. We were just sick and just, missing home, missing family. And there was a ding at the gate outside. And I went out, and Tomas is sitting there. I didn't even know he knew where we lived. And he's sitting there holding a big pot in his hand. And I'm like, what in the world? And he said, hey, it's time for you to try puchero.
Nice.
And his wife had made up a big homemade pot of puchero.
Good timing.
Left it for us just kind of as like a New Year's gift or just a friend gift or something. And we opened it up, and seriously, all of us just started crying because it was just the timing. And it was the first major extension of friendship we felt like, initiated towards us by a Spanish friend. And here we are eating like the traditional dish that we can't get in any restaurant. We're having it for the first time. And it's like chicken noodle soup that totally like hit on a American bone for us of like, oh, we're sick. And mom came and gave us, it just, I just get teared up right now just talking about the story. Cause it was such a blessing. And he just, that was one of the just friendship benefits that came out of this bicultural bridge, intentional work that we were doing towards Tomas. And he just helped us navigate a lot of things that we were saying wrong and being, either naive Americans or ugly Americans. He just helped us smooth out a lot of those rough edges.
And they, and I was just thinking as you were talking about Tomas, I just was thinking about key friendships within our neighborhood in Central Asia that were just neighbors, but these neighbors became great friends, and they also became teachers for us. We learned about our neighborhood and the history of our neighborhood. Every neighborhood in Tajikistan has some kind of key individual. A lot of times they've been there the longest, or their father and their father's father, people, they have a history there in that neighborhood. So they kind of are that key individual when you have an issue or a problem, maybe with your electricity or your water, or someone came to your door, some official, and you're trying to figure out what's going on here. What do they want? You go to this guy, and we would sit with him, and he would just be a wealth of information, and he wasn't offended by questions, like you said. And I love that, what you're saying, like about bicultural bridges not being offended by our questions and having the patience to explain and to sit with us and answer some of those questions. So for me, it was, I had a couple of those people. Olim was one of them. Muhammad Dean was another one. And these guys were just so great at, just even some of the faux pas that we did make in the early days, when speaking of food, like when people would bring us food, there's a tradition of, well, you got to return the plate that they brought it on with something that you're offering them. You got to, you can't return an empty plate, So if one of our bicultural bridges didn't talk to us about that and inform us, we would have kept making that mistake. But we were able to make a correction there. So
little things of just interaction hosting. How you build friendship. They're different.
Yes.
They're different whenever you just don't know those and you don't learn them in a class.
Yeah.
So,
Good. Well,
that's
good.
great.
This is great. So anything else on bicultural bridges before we move on to the next lens we're going to talk about?
Yeah. I mean, just, so currently right now, we're just in that first stage of feeling that. So we're in Denver, we're not in a cross-cultural setting, but it is our first time living in Denver. And so we really are taking missional lenses on the place. So some that are starting to emerge as potential bicultural bridges just in the few months that we've been here. My brother, he's a pastor in the area, and there's a couple other local pastors that I've been in regular communication with, and just feeling out what is their sense. They've been pastors here for a while. What is their sense and what's going on spiritually in the city? What is God doing even in this time of COVID? What is he challenging the church to be in this area? That's been really helpful. Roger, who's a guy from Nova, which is the organization I formerly was with, he lives in the area. He's a longtime missionary. He has a real missional view on things. He's been a huge resource to us. Natalie at the credit union, a lady we went in to just talk about what does financing look like for homes in the area. She's a local, grew up here, and she's just a spout of resource and information. So we've connected with her a few times. Who knows? Maybe that could become a friendship that then also helps us, kind of grease the skids into where we should be in the area. Yeah. The friends that we're staying with here in our soft landing, the Olsons, they've lived here most of their lives, and they've just been a great connection and a resource. So some of these people are already showing, that they could be either short-term or maybe long-term bicultural bridges for us for setting up life well here for our family, but also for our global ministry, so.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank the Lord for those key connections, key relationships that function as bicultural bridges. Such a gift when we have them and when we can cultivate them. Like you said, it makes all the difference. And to kind of wrap this part of the discussion up, how does that in turn lead you to make important decisions around your transition? What are some ways cultivating these relationships help you make those decisions?
Some of the ways that they help cut through layers that would take you years. And maybe never understand.
Exactly. Yeah. So just to being informed, and at whatever we do, we can take that information in our conversations with our spouses, with our teammates, to the Lord, and have, which I believe are just treasure trove of information in insider kind of insight, insider understanding into the way we make decisions. Great. Okay. Well, next one,
living space and transport. Okay. So this gets into just some real tangible, actual physical space. And then how do we actually physically get around in the city? A lot of times this is one of those areas that's really hard to disconnect our own American cultural lenses from. And so this is one I really challenge people to say, okay, instead of just making the assumption of, okay, let me find a comfortable American housing and then get around like I normally would in America, which often for most still is by car, to actually think outside of those boxes and say, what makes most sense in this city, and how can I think about that in a way that will help me engage with the culture more often and regularly, even when I don't feel like it, which may be a lot of the time.
Yes.
Is sometimes it's just tiring, right? It's tiring to talk on a second grade level in a new language, even though you have a master's degree. It's embarrassing. It's tiring, but to have a space and then ways that you get around that force you to constantly engage, help you grow so much faster. And it's very easy to just find a comfortable space and even a space to isolate from the culture.
Yeah.
So this is where we decide to set up life, the structure of our dwelling, the modes of transportation that we choose to get around, our intentional routes. They all affect and influence our immersion into that culture. So engaging a place in which to live, in which there's ease of access and engagement with the culture. So thinking about this, instead of being in a house where your front door is actually separated by a gate and a distance from the street, just that small distance itself is going to put another hurdle or two in the way of you engaging, as opposed to being in an apartment complex where every time you walk out in the hallway, there's other people there. You walk out on the street and the traffic's going, and that sort of thing. So even thinking along those lines, not necessarily just buying a car right off the bat like we're used to in America, but thinking, actually, could I, what could it be like to be carless in this city? That's actually a huge trend globally and in the US, is to actually make the choice to go carless, not only for the environment, but also for your communal interaction and getting to know people, and actually using public transportation more, riding bikes more, walking more. Those kinds of things take you outside of your bubble. And it's so much a part of America, the beautiful neighborhood that we're living in, but everyone's driving their car and then they pull into their garage and you never see them.
Right.
And I've only met one neighbor, and I've really been trying hard, in the 3 months we've been here. That's just a part of the American culture that we have to kind of look past if we want to engage. Being in a place that might be too rural or back from the street, or having a easy garage to just drive into. So for example, we ended up being in a small house in Spain, and in Spain, everyone has either a wall or a gate around their property. So it does feel like it's quite isolated. And so one thing we intentionally did, without being too culturally inappropriate, is actually took down the grass skirting that was covering the bars in the front of our house. We actually took that down, and then we made an intentionality most of the year, the weather's nice, to actually sit out on that front porch right outside that gate, and do most of our meals there as much as possible. Okay. And that put us in a place where we saw the neighbors walking by. We would talk and intentionally reach out, not in an awkward way, but engage in conversation, and really helped us to get to know our neighbors. And it could have been very easy to just keep those up for more privacy, to stay in, in our house, and not engage. We have other friends that, took a beautiful house with a beautiful view, but it was way up on a hill, and it wasn't one where you could really walk or bike or get around the town and engage a lot. And they always felt like we were in the center of the city, which kind of were, but it was quite easy for us if we chose, and we really tried to be intentional, to bike and walk to most places, which put us out on the streets, put us on the sidewalks, put us in a place where we had to use our language a lot more. And so we didn't do it perfect by any means, but those were some of the things that take down some of those unnecessary barriers to that. It might be that, thinking counterculturally, taking the bus, taking the subway, riding a bike, though it's going to take longer. I know that grates on our American efficiency and effectiveness, but that could be the thing that makes a difference of really finding home in the culture, or always feeling like a foreigner.
Yeah. And as we talk about this, I'm thinking, that there's really no one kind of right or wrong answer to this
Mhm.
question of transport and living space and things, because everywhere it's so different and there's so many things that you need to factor in. But I think what you're saying is leaning into the opportunities to engage and to engage with the culture and the way we choose our living space and transport options, how we get around different things like that, that makes a difference. And
Yeah.
it can make a difference. So I kind of, as I was thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking about the balance that we have to bring to this sometimes, because speaking from a family, a married couple with kids, for example, how do we bring the balance to that if we're saying, well, we need transport to get around?
Yeah.
We're going to, our decision to maybe not have a car or to have a really small living space is going to add stress to the family,
Right.
So there's a balance there. I think we can still have a refuge, a place, a home
Hmm.
that is conducive to family life and healthy, family relationships. Obviously that's a priority, that should be a priority, and
Hmm.
also take these into consideration.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of for us, as we've navigated transitions through the years, had to kind of strike a balance there in some ways.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. One of the examples that I've come across several times when working with missionaries who are burning out, uh, a lot of times we end up, even if we have different ministry focus, but a lot of church planning
Mm-hmm.
type folks, they'll end up starting with a gathering in their home. They're
Mm-hmm.
getting to
Right.
know some people. They have create a place of belonging, a small group where they start maybe doing DMM or,
Mm-hmm.
doing a worship service in their home. That's kind of where the church starts. And this is true, I think, in America, church plants too, that often because we are so committed to hosting and making a comfortable environment, we can forget the needs of our family.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the
Mm-hmm.
whole home is open to ministry, and there's no longer a sacred place. There's no longer a private place. There's
Yeah.
no longer space to just be family. And in some cultures, you go and you're trying to figure out what the social interaction is supposed to look like, and people are just walking into your home or that kind of thing, and you're trying to get used to it. What does it mean to also protect some of your identity as a family, if you're Americans or whatever, but also
Mm-hmm.
have a safe space that's just for the family, just to be able to be who you are as a family, interact with your kids. And, if having a car and having that as an option, even if you choose to mainly use public transportation, but then you do have a car to maybe go take a vacation, to take a trip to go and explore other parts of the country and that kind
Right.
of thing.
Right. Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
choice for the balance
Right.
that can really make a difference between burnout and family conflict that's
For sure.
unnecessary.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I like that, perspective of balance. And yeah, just thinking about our last assignment in Istanbul, where, you got a city of 18, 20 million people, traffic is crazy. I mean, you can
Mm-hmm.
take, if you have your own car, um, great, but it's going to take you potentially longer to get somewhere than if you were to use public transport, because
Mm-hmm.
you're just sitting in traffic. So we had our first several months there in Istanbul without our own vehicle, and I'll tell you, I wouldn't. Now looking back, I wouldn't trade it for the world. It was a really rich time of we got to know the city more by doing
Mm-hmm.
that,
Mm-hmm.
the ins and outs of the different forms of transport, the little, even our kind of go-to places for coffee and for food and different things we discovered along the way, using public transport. Then we thought, oh, we're getting we finally got our own vehicle, and we were thinking, boy, this is going to be so great. It's just going to, give us so much more, free us up and give us more time. And it really didn't, as far as the
Mm-hmm.
commute in the city. I would at times just prefer to go stick with the public transport. But like you were saying, sometimes it's just for family, to benefit the family. We really just found that the vehicle helped us get outside the city at times. So on the weekends, we would go out to the coast, to the sea, which would be very difficult and challenging without a vehicle. So that kept us, kind of refueled us and energized us and gave us time as a family together, with that opportunity to drive out to a place like that. But there's a lot, and I was thinking homeschooling as well. That was another thing, in Central Asia, when we were there, we ended up with a pretty large house, one of our first house that we were able to move into there. And at first I'm thinking, what are we going to do with all this space? Well, we ended up, because public school was just not a viable option for us at that time in the country, we ended up homeschooling, and we knew that was the direction we were going to go, but really I didn't personally think through what kind of space you need for that. And that was so that whole section of the house that I didn't think we needed, was very, very nice to have for homeschooling our kids, So there's all these kinds of things that again, going back to the balance and what's important. If someone digs in their heels, one of the, the husband or the wife, or if you're a team, if you're roommates, and we should have this, and being very like minimalistic, I guess you could say, in terms of what they think they need, and not taking into consideration, I guess, the needs of the group or the family. That can be problematic for sure.
One of the ways I kind of characterize it and talk with folks is, it's okay now and then to take off the missionary hat. You don't have to have the constant intensity of trying to just initiate and then be intentional with culture all the time. You, just like with work and life, there's time when you set down work to just be family. If you have a 9-to-5 job, that's a little easier. Your commute home is your time to diffuse, take off the work hat and be with family. But in the ministry world, as we know, it's just a constant blended schedule all the time, and we can end up putting on that hat and never taking it off, and that wreaks havoc on a family, that wreaks havoc on our health, and so like one of the ways that comes to mind with our kids is, they were just absorbing the Spanish. They're in Spanish school, they're just passing us by, and so we're like, man, we got to get on this bandwagon a lot better. We're doing our own class and all that. But a lot of our ministry, because it's with global workers, even though we were in Spain, we were doing a lot of our work in English. So we're like, hey, let's just start speaking Spanish in the home with our kids, or make every Tuesday, Thursday Spanish day, And so in the house, we would do that. The kids hated it, even though they were much better than us. And they wanted us to get better. They hated it. And we're like, what is it? And we realized that being in the home and us speaking English and knowing mommy and daddy in the voice that they usually use was a safety for them, a comfort thing for them. And we actually talked with their teachers at the Spanish school, and they even told us in Spanish, like, you know what? We've learned this with, international students. Speak your own language at home. It's important for them. They continue to grow in that, and that's a safety for them. When they're here at school, we will, push them in their Spanish. You don't need to do that at home. So we're like, okay, we've got to find other ways to continue to grow in our Spanish, because the kids aren't going to help us. When we're out on the street, they had no problem with us speaking Spanish with our friends. They didn't mind it. But once we stepped in the door, that was a bit of a safety zone for them.
Sure.
And they wanted mom and dad to sound like mom and dad.
Right.
So that was one thing we said, okay, no, we don't have to do that, Now and then I'd trick them while we're playing Legos. I'd switch to Spanish, and then they'd catch me. Hey, what are you doing?
Fun.
So
good. Good. All right.
Yeah.
So anything else on this whole area of living space and transport, Jeff?
Yeah, just one last thing. This doesn't necessarily fit directly with the living space or transport, but social schedule goes along with this. being intentional with your social schedule. And one thing that we've found, and was a challenge for us, is how much time do you spend with other expats if you're in an area that there's other expats in, whether they're missionaries or international business people or whatever, and how much time do you spend with locals, with the natives? It's important, actually, to have relationships and some life-giving time with both. But sometimes, too, it can be very easy to slip into just filling your social schedule with other expats, that also becomes an isolating thing for your growth in the culture. So one thing I encourage people is to have both, but actually prioritize the friendships and the interaction with the locals first and foremost on your calendar, and then make time for the other. And that could end up being, maybe not fully understood by some of the expats. It could lead to maybe difficult conversations. We had to have some of those. Some people felt offended that we weren't spending as much time with them as with our Spanish friends, and we had to find the balance. We didn't do it perfectly, but, just to think about how you fill your schedule and where you spend your time is important too. So
that's good. Yeah. Thinking about that, Jeff, I just, when, in Central Asia, when our kids were little, they would just automatically gravitate to playing with the neighbor kids, the nationals, the neighbors, that were so different in so many ways, but they just love to hang out and play with each other and play soccer out on the street and stuff. And so that was easy to not, that wasn't something we didn't have to force, our kids to do, like go play with, the neighbors, or go hang out with the neighbors, or invite the neighbor kids to come to our house. And so they had a lot of time, but as they get older, it can be more of a challenge at times, I think, especially if there is an expat community with other tweens and teens that they feel a lot more in common with, so for us, that was a challenge. And we did discover that we did realize that we need to allow them to make some choices in that as they got older. Like, we're gonna intentionally, spend time with our national friends, but they needed to have that time with the other expat kids in the community. That was important for their overall happiness, I think, and just a sense of that they were part of something, that they were connected, in that way. So, but what you're saying about social schedule, boy, that can be a real tricky place at times to navigate and to be intentional around prioritizing the relationships with the national community and our neighbors and friends in the community. Well, we've talked about a couple more lenses here in this whole process of landing and setting up well. So over the last couple, our previous episode and this one today, we've covered a few of those lenses, but there's 7 of them. So tell us how what you've got, and as we wrap up here, what you've got coming down the pipes as far as your work in ministry, and how our listeners might be able to take advantage of that to get more information, to learn more, and to engage with this whole process.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks for that. Right now with the way between, I'm actually teasing these out into some blog entries. So you could actually get a look at all 7 of these lenses. We've covered them 4 on this podcast, which just really appreciate the opportunity to have this, rich discussion with you, Tim, in this way. So thewaybetween.org is our organization website. And feel free to see what we've got going on there. We do coaching and transition with global workers in major transition. So whether that's heading to the field or coming back, or if you're in a major discernment time, a sabbatical time, we love to engage and come alongside workers in that. So you can look at these coming up on the blog, see these teased out more. Happy to answer any questions too. Please feel free to go to the website and contact us. But yeah, just my encouragement, kind of an ending encouragement here, is that empower you that you can be very intentional and engage the Lord in a powerful way when you're landing and trying to set up life well. You don't have to just be in a sense, of the mercy of the new culture, but there's ways to really engage it in a powerful, mature way through these lenses that can really make the difference between immersing and finding home there, or always living in frustration as being the outsider, which just wears you down. And we see a lot of people leave the field because of that.
Right.
And lastly, one thing that's been interesting to me being back stateside now is there's been a lot of great energy around the missional church discussion on the local level in the U.S. But what's interesting too, coming out of a missiology background, I see a lot of the local church fads in missional church discussion making the same mistakes that missionaries were making on the field 20, 30 years ago, that we learn about in our, pre-field orientations and this kind of thing. We see the same mistakes going on. And I would actually encourage people to think about these lenses from a corporate perspective as a church. A lot of times that I see local churches looking for that great property or that new building and kind of losing sight that the church is not the building or even the place we gather on Sunday or Wednesday night. It's where the people live and what's going on. How do we engage what the Lord is actually doing in our neighborhoods?
That's
and a church could actually take these 7 lenses, think through them intentionally about their city and about their neighborhood. And that could be a really great guide as to actually where to gather, how to gather, and how to engage more missionally in a local way. So that's just something that, really has entered our thoughts, planting back in the U.S., surrounded by all kinds of churches around here, which was not true for where we were on the field, So
Yeah. Great, Jeff. That's, when you talk about just how you could, how we can utilize and take advantage of these lenses here at home, and in terms of the church using these, what an opportune time, I think, for many congregations to, as in this season of COVID and how we've had to adapt and shift and change, but are also so many looking strategically what could be, what's next, and how are we going to embrace this next season strategically and intentionally. And so I love that, and I think it's such an opportune time for that. And maybe that could just be another podcast conversation around that locally,
that'd be powerful
for churches. Yeah. So we can think about that, but great. Well, it's been great having you back, Jeff. Thanks again for coming on the show, but also more than that, just what you and Sara do with The Way Between. Again, for our listeners, just head over to The Way Between. Is it The Way Between or Way Between?
thewaybetween.org.
thewaybetween.org. Head over there and check out what they have in terms of resources and things coming up. And again, Jeff, thanks again for being with me. Appreciate you guys so much. We'll talk to you real soon.
Major pleasure. Thank you, Tim. Always enjoy it.
Great. Bye-bye.
Great. Okay. Bye-bye.
I trust you've been both encouraged and challenged by our conversation today. As a reminder, don't forget to check out the resources Jeff and his wife Sara provide on their website, thewaybetween.org. The theme of intentional engagement has been impressed upon me during these conversations with Jeff. Engaging the process, engaging the people, engaging the culture. I want to encourage you to position yourself to engage the transition season you're in. Whether you need support working through an unexpected change or planning and strategizing something new, reach out to me at encompasslifecoaching.com and begin to navigate your transition with confidence and clarity. Thanks again for joining me for this episode of Navigate. I've been your host, Tim Austin. I'll catch you next time.